my name is Beck and welcome to my first author spotlight, and this is an idea that I got from my friend Marie, and I will link her blog post down below which inspired this video idea. So an author spotlight is really a combination of like a reading wrap up and an author reading guide. I kind of want to tell you about V E Schwab as an author, Victoria Schwab, what I rated her books, what I enjoyed about them, what they're generally about, and where I think you should start reading them. So without further ado, let's jump into where I started with V E Schwab, and that was with Vicious, and this is a morally grey story. It follows Victor and Eli, and they are college students and they're working on this way to become extraordinary. So they essentially want to tap into that innate part of their brain to give themselves supernatural powers. It does work, there are consequences, really dark ones, and also this is told in a time kind of leap. So you see from Victor and Eli when they're finding out all of this extraordinary potential at college, and then after that there's a 10-year time skip and they're mortal enemies. And I quite like that dichotomy, and I like the way that V E Schwab generally writes morally grey characters, or characters that don't have that golden hero kind of syndrome where you get the good hero that is the ultimate good. She likes to give her characters a little bit of power and watch them play with that dynamic, because if you give people a little bit of power, it tends to go to their head, and that tends to be what she represents in her work, and Vicious is definitely an example of that. Additionally, she's also written Vengeful, which is the sequel to Vicious. This is a duology, and so if you're wanting a series that is not too long, that is kind of urban fantasy-esque, because it's set in our world, I'd recommend starting here, because when I look at her work, I think that my expectations grew with the things that I read. So these were pretty good, but I think her other series, in my personal opinion, have been a lot better and some of my favorites. That's why I started here, because I wanted to not get too overwhelmed by everybody's hype about V E Schwab, and so I thought starting here would be a good idea, and it really turned out that way. I quite enjoyed both of these. I think I gave them 4 stars or 4.5. They were excellent. I loved how morally grey they were. I loved the storytelling. I loved that all the characters had their own unique drive to them, and I think that V E Schwab does that really, really well. She definitely develops her characters and asks the right questions, and that's why I keep going back to her work. Now, V E Schwab tends to write different kinds of categories. So she writes across middle grade, which is for younger readers, she writes young adult, which is obviously for teenagers, and then she writes adult. So those ones that I just talked about, those are young adult, and she tends to write under V E Schwab for young adult and adult, and she writes under Victoria Schwab for her middle grade books. So the next one that I want to talk about is also a duology, and if you're looking for a young adult series that doesn't have any romance in it, which is what initially drew me to these books, then I think you'll really enjoy these. Again, it's another play on a morally grey concept, and I quite enjoyed the world building in this as well. She's deviated from just writing urban fantasy to writing an actual more fantasy focused world. And those are This Savage Song and Our Dark Duet, and because my brain is the way it is, I predicted the endings of both of these, but from reviews that I've seen, I don't think many people did that. I'm just weird. I just overthink things as I read them, and I accidentally figured out the endings for both. But generally, she's an author that surprises me, and I didn't figure out the endings for the other 2 books that I talked about. I haven't figured out the endings for her other work. It was just these 2 randomly on a whim. So these ones that follow Kate and August, and Kate is a human, August is a demon. The world they live in is one that if you do something really bad, if you commit a heinous crime, then a demon literally manifests from the darkness that was invoked by creating that crime. So there are 3 different kinds of demons in this world. They all range in severity. August is one of them though. He's probably the one that is one of the most intelligent ones because he's mostly human-like. Essentially, Kate and August both want to be what the other are. So Kate wants all the power and August just wants to be human, and naturally they do meet up, but I don't want to say when, because this is another story that is quite interesting and unique and dark, and it also has brilliant action in it, and it's gone a little bit further than the previous book, like I said, and done some excellent world building in there as well. So again, I think these are brilliant places to start, mostly because they're also not that long. Like, they're just a duology, they're not a massive epic fantasy series, and I think that's another strength of V E Schwab. She tends to write fast, snappy books that have a lot of character and a lot of meaning to them, and that's what she's done in this duology. And I also really loved that it didn't have a love interest, because I read a lot of YA and most of it had that love triangle or love interest scenario, and that doesn't happen here. I quite liked it for that particular reason. Not the only reason, but one of the strong reasons that I really like this is because of that. So I think I also gave these around 4 stars each. Not quite 5 stars, Not yet, but I did still really like them, and obviously I would recommend them. And now I want to talk about her middle grade. So I've loved all of her middle grade. I think she writes the different tones and the different world buildings and details into her work in a way that is very palpable for the different age ranges that she focuses on. So if you're trying to traverse her writing, a lot of her themes and her characterization really carry over in the different categories that she writes. And I think that's brilliant because it still keeps her tone and her flavor, but it makes it more malleable depending on what age group she's talking to. And I really appreciate and enjoy that nuance to her work too. The middle grade that I want to talk about first is The Archived by her, and that is also a duology. She tends to write duologies, I've noticed. And this is a middle grade duology following a girl whose father used to traverse the lands between the living and the dead. So there is essentially a library for when people die, and that's why it's called an archive. He mans that archive to make sure nobody escapes from it so that they don't become uncomfortable and angry spirits in the in-between. And so after his legacy, the main character in that book picks up his legacy and has been trained by him all this time. Naturally, a ghost escapes and it's not a good time, but I don't want to give more info than that because it's not also a very long book. So if I give too much away, then it's going to spoil things naturally. But again, I gave that a 3 or 4 stars. I quite enjoyed it, but because of different things that the publisher did to V E Schwab when she first published it, I'm not going to be buying the rest of those books, but I did quite enjoy them. Eventually, at some day, I would like to continue and support her, but I really liked it. I'm not continuing it now, but it is one of the very rare instances where I probably wouldn't actively continue reading an old series by her, but I'm really keen on anything that she's published, and I've read a lot of her backlist already. Another middle grade series that she's written is City of Ghosts, and I've got The Tunnel of Bones and The City of Ghosts here. This is another middle grade by her, and it's an ongoing series. The latest book, The Bridge of Souls, came out this year in March, and this is a book that follows Cassidy Blake, and she's a young girl. She's like 11, 10 or something. Again, it's middle grade, so it's for a younger tiered audience. But like I said, V E Schwab's themes and her characterization really switch over from her older work. And so in here, I really loved it because I got to see Cassidy grow and experience questions and tension, and I quite liked that about it too. So Cassidy is a girl whose parents have this TV show, and it's a ghost show. So they essentially go to different places around the world and they explore whether ghosts are there or not. One of her parents is a believer, one is an absolute non-believer. The catch is that Cassidy actually can see ghosts and knows they're real, but her parents don't know that she can do that. When she was younger, she went off a bridge by accident riding her bike, and she went into kind of the in-between between life and death, and a ghost in the lake pulled her back, and his name is Jacob. So her best friend is a ghost named Jacob. She obviously travels across the world. This one is set in Edinburgh, this one is set in Paris. I'm not sure where the third book is set. And I quite like the way that the places change, the way that her experiences change, and the way that the characters, especially Jacob and Cassidy, are really growing together, and their relationship is developing, not in like a romance, obviously it's very young still, but they both have their own unique perspectives and identities. It is told just from Cassidy's voice, so I like that she captures all of those things too. So City of Ghosts was excellent, and I'm likely going to reread this. I think I gave it a 5 stars, and I might have given this a 5 stars, if not a 4 or 4.5. Both of them were really enjoyable, and that's why I'm talking about them now. And then last but not least, I want to talk about her adult work. So this includes a comic, a series, and a standalone. So the comic is The Still Prince, and this is linked to her Shades of Magic series. This follows the king who is in the Shades of Magic series. Obviously, he's now a prince in this one because it's a prequel. His name is Maxim, and it follows his, I guess, journey to power and the tensions on the way to doing that. But when I read this, I expected the nuance of V E Schwab's writing, and it just did not translate to me personally, especially in this comic book format. So I only gave this a 3 stars, I think, and I've kept it because I met her at a convention and she signed it to me. So I don't want to get rid of it because it's a nice memento, but at the same time, I didn't love it, and I don't know if I would recommend it. It really depends on what mood you're in and what kind of thing you like to read. I wanted to really love these comics because I love reading comic books, and obviously I really am a fan of V E Schwab, but it didn't really work out that way. it just felt very surface level when I'm used to her stories delving a bit deeper, and maybe it delves deeper later, but it just wasn't enough of a hook for me to actually get invested in this. I did really like her trilogy though that this is a spin-off from, and that is A Darker Shade of Magic, A Gathering of Shadows, and A Conjuring of Light. And this is a series that follows a multitude of characters, not too many though. It's set in London, or a version of London. There are 4 different kinds. There's red, white, grey, and black London. Red London is the one where our main character Kel lives, and Kel is one of the last travellers. So he has this magical ability that lets him traverse between worlds, and so he works for the Prince Rhys. I can't remember his name's pronunciation. He goes back and forth for Rhys, and he's essentially the messenger for the royal family. And so when he's in White London or Grey London one of the days, something is stolen from him by this master thief named Lila Bard. And Lila Bard is another character in here. And so that is really their meeting. They're both very morally grey kinds of characters. Kel obviously wants to be a good person, but Lila is obviously a thief and a rogue. So it's nice to see that collision happen. But getting back to the Londons, Black London is the one that has been completely sealed off because I think there was like a magical plague or a curse or something, and so it got sealed off. Red London is where all the magic thrives, and then Grey and White London aren't really where magic comes through very often. But in Kel's world, lots of people live there, lots of magic thrives, and so I guess that's kind of the London that you want to be in. There is a power struggle between royal families in here. There are cool magic scenes and battle scenes. There's an arena fight in the second book, which I adored. There are pirates in here too, which is awesome. It's just a book series that is also very queer positive, and I really loved, again, the quests in here, the characters. I liked how all of them came together, and I like how there's a varied cast of them as well. It's not just Kel and Lila, it's Alucard and a few others too. And so getting all of those mixing together gives you a bit of variation. So if you're into fantasy, I think you would love this. And I think if you're not really into fantasy yet, this is an excellent place to start because it's not too busy, it's not too grand scale, but it's enough to make you captured and it's enough to invest you. And I started my reading year out with these one year and I absolutely loved all of them. I think the second book was by far my favorite, but I'm just a sucker for an arena game in a book. So I would encourage you to read these as well. And V E Schwab actually is writing a continuation series for these called The Touch of Power. It is not obviously out yet, but it does contain the characters that got through the end of the third book. You will see them in A Touch of Power. And then lastly, I want to talk about The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue because this is a book by V E Schwab that made my favorites list one year. I have a separate review for it. I absolutely loved this. It follows Addie and she's in 18th century France for the opening of the book. And in that timeline, she doesn't want to go down the path that has been set out for her. There's an arranged marriage. She just wants to get out of her town and travel a little bit and live her life. And so she makes this deal by accident that is more involved than she thought it would be. And so she accidentally calls essentially Lucifer and makes a deal with him. And so naturally he curses her. So she wants to travel and live her life and he gives her immortality so that she can do that basically forever, but that means that he won't ever have access to her soul because he only gets her soul when she dies. So his curse to her is that nobody remembers her, and so she has to go through this immortal life without being able to build any kind of connections. And so this book really discusses identity and art and who you are as a person and your interactions with other people. And one day when Addie is in modern day New York, so she's about 300 years old by this point, she runs into this guy named Henry in a bookstore, and then she comes back the next day and somehow he remembers her. And so that's really where this story triggers some kind of chain of events. And ultimately I just loved how existential this is. V E Schwab's existential kind of understanding of the world, existence and identity really plays a part in her other books, especially her adult work, but I think it really came to a head here, and this felt very different to what she's written before. And she said that this had been on her back burner for like 10 years or something, and she only felt ready to write it very recently based on all the experiences she's already had. So that really came through in this, and I really appreciated it for that reason. Not that I didn't appreciate her other work, I really enjoyed those too, but this clearly hit very different for me compared to what her other books were. If you are going to start with The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, I feel like you're going to be disappointed with her other books because they're just very tonally different. So in conclusion, I guess I'm saying start with her middle grade work or her urban fantasy duologies, or if you're a huge fantasy reader, go into A Darker Shade of Magic, but don't start with A Darker Shade of Magic because that is a scale of fantasy that is quite well developed and detailed. And so if you're going to go into that and then go into her duologies, I think you're going to struggle a little bit because they're very different setups to stories, and I found at least the fantasy books to be a lot more satisfying. So if you want, just start with this one. I mean, it's my favorite, so I've got to recommend it, right? But that is it for my V E Schwab author spotlight. Thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know if you've read this author before. I would really love to know. And if I've made you pick up one of the books by her, let me know which one it is. But again, thank you so much for watching this video. I'll come chat to you down below and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.